Hello, students, and welcome to the hybrid lecture for our reading of Death Constant Beyond Love, short story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I want to tell you a little bit about Marquez, and then we'll talk about reading this short story in particular. So you can see his birth and death dates there. He died not long ago. He lived through a politically tumultuous time in Colombia, where a heritage of colonial control and Cold War proxy wars loomed large. I don't really want to get into a bunch of specifics of Colombian history here, because our text doesn't really require it, but we'll think about how this text connects with European traditions in thought and writing as well. He's a Nobel Prize winner for his novels 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. His fiction presents a world where emotions and reason, folk traditions and science, and even dreaming and waking sometimes merge to create a world of story. If you like fiction in which you can really get lost, where you get to feel like you know a place and its people, I'd highly recommend you check out his novels. Before he established himself as a novelist, he was a journalist, and this is going to matter for a couple reasons. First, we might say that some of his characteristic realism comes from having a journalist's view of the world. His fiction trades in fact as much as it does in fantasy. Also, it makes sense for a journalist to be politically engaged. By the time we're done, we'll have to consider what Marquez is saying about politics in this story. So let's talk about magical realism. There's a definition here: a genre where magical and unreal elements play a natural part in an otherwise realistic environment. This is an aesthetic that's often associated with the Latin American boom. This bunch of Latin American writers who got really popular in the 70s and 80s. For better or for worse, we'll think about how these magical elements show up in this story. I want to look at this diagram a little bit, though. It's a really useful way to think about the different ways we approach literature as an object of study. In this case, we're thinking about the definition of magical realism. So, we have, at least three possible relationships to think about here. And we might think about how the relationship between work and the universe is what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about how the work relates to the world it represents. And there's another important relationship to consider, which is between the audience and the work. So how is the reader supposed to respond to the magical elements of a magical realist piece of fiction? So when we think about the effect of presenting these kinds of magical elements in the story, and if you haven't read yet, you'll see immediately what I'm talking about. We'll have to see what response we're supposed to have to them. Oftentimes, magical realism works by getting us to look at something again, something we thought we already understood. So as you read this story, you might think, what is it trying to get us to see again? What is Marquez asking us to look at that we hadn't seen before? Let's talk about close reading here. Here's an example of a passage that we could easily do a close reading exercise on. So this is a description of Sanchez, the main character, in his car. And at this point, I'd like you to just pause the video for a minute and answer the questions below about diction, metaphor, and imagery. And I think that you'll see that these guides lead you right into the kinds of evidence that we use when we make a literary argument. So as you record your answers to these questions about diction, metaphor, and imagery, just hold on to them, and I'll ask you to turn those in as informal writing at the end of this session. Of course, close reading is not the only way to get into a text. Another way in is to think about the literary allusions that are made in a text. So these allusions and references, these are things that are normally be footnoted, especially in a text like the Norton Anthology. And sometimes we can learn something extra by sort of digging these references up. So let's look at this. In our text, we have all these passages and all these references to Marcus Aurelius. And so here are a couple of them, right? That talking about Sanchez being 42, a reader of badly translated Latin classics. And we see that in his speech, the speech that had been memorized and ground out so many times, had not occurred to him in the nature of telling the truth, but rather as the opposite of a fatalistic pronouncement by Marcus Aurelius in the 4th book of his Meditations. If we don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, these things are confusing to us. They're sort of meaningless. But let's look down and see what he has to say. So here are a couple passages from Aurelius. Aurelius is a Stoic philosopher, and he's telling people to learn not to fear death. So he says things like this: death is such as generation is, a mystery of nature, a composition out of the same elements, and a decomposition into the same. And altogether not a thing of which any man should be ashamed, for it's not contrary to the nature of a reasonable animal, and not contrary to the reason of our constitution. So basically he's saying, no man should be ashamed of death. It's just a thing that happens. And you can see him in a similar strain. If any god told you that you would die tomorrow, or certainly the day after tomorrow, you would not care much whether it was on the 3rd day or tomorrow, unless you were in the highest degree mean-spirited. For how small is the difference? So think it no great thing to die after as many years as you can name, rather than tomorrow. So again, here's Aurelius saying, hey, toughen up, it's just death. And as you read, you'll have to see whether Sanchez is living up to this. I think pretty clearly he is a failure by Aurelius's terms, because he is living in the fear of death. At the end of the session, I'll ask you to think about extending this failure of Sanchez to live up to this ideal. Here's another intertext for us, connected to the title. So we probably don't have time to dissect this sonnet. This isn't really a class about poetry. But this sonnet, Love Constant Beyond Death, is the famous Spanish 16th century poet Francisco de Quevedo, who provides the title, reversed for us, Death Constant Beyond Love. And if you look at it, this is a sonnet about eternal love lasting beyond death. So this is a sonnet about how even the ashes of this lover will still love the woman that he was with after he's dead. And so I want you to take as long as you want to look at this poem, but think about why Marquez would want to reverse this and say death constant beyond love instead of love constant beyond death. And I'm going to suggest that this and the Aurelius both have something to do with the colonial heritage of Colombia. That this is kind of a response to that domination by Europe. So here we have again a confounding of this European tradition. Now there's a third reference I want to look at, and this one is maybe the most interesting. At one point, Nelson Farina, the father of the woman that Sanchez spends his final days with, calls Sanchez the Blachman de la Politique. And unraveling this is pretty interesting. So Blachman's a really interesting figure here. He's a character who's appeared in other Marquez stories, but he was also a real guy. So check this out. He was a circus kind of entertainer. It was claimed he could do miracles, just like Sanchez, actually. So that might be one reason he's the Blachman de Politique. His most famous thing, you can see, yeah, here he is. This is a Hindu animal hypnotist. And here's a photograph of him. He's a real guy. There he is, staring down an alligator. His most famous trick, though, was this buried alive routine, which got him this nickname, the man who died twice. Which we might also think about in relation to Sanchez. This presence of death in the story. Now, what's really interesting here, too, is that the real Blachman's biography really adds something to this story. In his lifetime, he was identified as either African or Indian or some kind of exotic native, but he was actually an Italian man. So we see again this strange blending of worlds that accompanies colonialism. This guy who seemed to be, this mystery, this magician, was actually, just a European person. His death, Blachman's death in Argentina, is reportedly it reportedly occurred during his buried alive stunt, but he just didn't come out that last time. So it's a really kind of delicious delicious reference to unpack for this text and see just who this Blackaman might have been. At this point, I would just like to leave you with some questions to consider as you're reading. Where do you see national and cultural hybridity or mixing in this story? As you read, I want you to think about places where we have characters who come from multiple nations, characters who have been exiled from one place, required to live somewhere else, those kinds of things. So how are we crossing national borders here? I'd like you to think about what elements of the story seemed impossible. What were the things that happened that obviously couldn't happen? But also pay attention to how they're treated in the text. Are they treated as impossibilities? Or are they treated as matter-of-fact realities? And then finally, think about this. This is the big sort of takeaway question. What's the story saying about the European colonial heritage of Latin America? Why is Sanchez not living up to these European ideals? What's happening in this text between Latin America and Europe?